The Wheel and the Butterfly. Written by Justice3442 and read
by Justice
and 3442. Part 3, Pinky vs. Daily Life. Chapter 16, Pinky vs. Mr. Mumbles. Dan sighed as he looked over the mangled mouse in Pinky's palms. To her credit, she obviously wasn't squeamish about vermin or even dead mangled ones. To her detriment, she was looking at him with sad, pleading eyes and quivering lips. A look he had begun to associate with him having to do some bizarre, asinine task if he wanted his roommate to be more than a sad, depressing heap for the foreseeable future.
What is it now?
Dan said in an exasperated tone, rolling his eyes. I opened the door, and I found this mouse, Pinky choked out.
And?
Dan said impatiently. Pinky's lip quivering intensified. It's dead! Ah! Pinky turned into a fountain of tears. Dan buried his face in his palm and slowly dragged the hand downward.
Thanks, Rumi. Couldn't have figured that one out without you. Well, I can't resurrect the dead. I mean, not without them becoming twisted versions of their former selves.
Dan replied. He shivered slightly as an unpleasant memory surfaced.
I'm not sure they'll ever clean all the blood off the pet cemetery.
Pinky regained her composure enough to choke out, We need to have a funeral! Pinky began crying once more. Dan threw his arms to his sides and looked at the sky in a seriously pose.
Yep, bizarre and asinine.
He cupped a hand over Pinky's mouth and stared into her watery blue eyes.
Okay, I'm going to remove my hand, and when I do, you're going to calmly explain to me why we're having a funeral for vermin.
Dan raised the index finger on his other hand and pointed at Pinky.
Now I want you to focus here. You'll be graded, and a bad score means you'll be sleeping in the car for 1 or more nights.
Pinky stifled her sobs and tears somewhat.
Understand?
Dan said. Pinky solemnly nodded and Dan removed his hands. We need to have a funeral so the family can move on, Pinky answered. Dan sighed.
This is probably going to be another explanation about stupid animals in his world being even stupider than the ones in her world. Save Mr. Mumbles, who understands English well enough to read.
Also, if the body isn't laid to rest properly, the mouse's spirit might seek revenge upon the living, Pinky added. Dan paused.
Okay, yeah, that's actually sort of a pretty good reason.
Dan sighed.
Fine!
Pinky's expression brightened. Really?
Yes, really.
Yay! Pinky said, taking her roommate in a hard embrace. In addition to his bones cracking, Dan felt something wet and viscous press against his back. Oops, Pinky muttered. Still held tightly in Pinky's embrace, Dan fixed her with a rageful stare, his lips pulled up into a sneer.
Pinky?
Dan said through gritted teeth, his eyes twitching.
Did you just squish mouse guts against me?
Pinky pensively looked to the side. Yes? She admitted, meeting his angry glare with a nervous smile.
Do me a favor and find a box or bag or anything to keep that thing in, and then wash your hands. I'm gonna go burn this shirt and then take a shower.
Pinky nodded vigorously. Sure thing, Dan. Elise examined a tape measure carefully.
Alright, Chris, that should do it.
She clicked a button on the tape measure and the tape slid back with a snap. Chris smiled, standing up and looking over the chairs that had been strategically placed. You think that'll do it for the load-bearing structures? Elise unfurled a blue and white set of blueprints.
With the couch and love seats at the end, yes.
Chris heard his phone ring. He pulled it out of his pocket and answered it with a, Hey, Dan.
Chris, I need you and Elise to come over here.
Dan replied. Yeah, we're kinda too busy for revenge. Chris's eyes went wide as he fully processed what Dan asked. Did you say me and Elise?
No, I said you and Elise. What you should have said was Elise and I.
Dan shouted into his phone angrily. Elise rolled the blueprints up and looked up at her husband. Okay, well, does your scheme include both of us? Chris continued. Dan sighed.
It's not a scheme, we need attendees.
We? Chris asked, as in you and Pinky? Elise smiled.
Oh, good. If Pinky's involved, it probably means it's something a bit tamer than Dan's usual rampage. And if it is a vengeance run, Pinky should keep the acts of violence to a minimum.
Elise paused as she dwelled on this more.
Though, we may be looking at more property damage.
Dan sighed louder this time.
Yes, she and me.
Chris smiled smugly. I think you mean she and I, Dan.
No one likes a grammar Nazi, Chris.
Dan responded. It was Chris's turn to sigh. Is it too much to ask I win one argument with Dan? Attendees for what? Pinky throwing another party?
Actually, she's throwing a funeral.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Who died? Elise's expression also changed to one of concern. Dan said something inaudible into the phone.
Mouse.
Chris paused, then started laughing. Dan, we're not attending a funeral for a mouse. Elise, likewise, broke into laughter. Dan put on a wicked smile and handed the phone to Pinkie Pie.
They seem reluctant.
In an instant, Pinkie snatched the phone. Oh, Chris, you do have to come. You just have to. Pinkie, because if you two don't come, the mice might not be at peace. And if he's not at peace, then his whole family might not be at peace. I don't think... And if they're not at peace, they might become distraught with grief. And they become distraught with grief, they might commit mass suicide. Mice don't. And if we don't have enough funerals for them, then their extended family might become distraught, and that means even more mice suicides. Then there will be dozens, hundreds, thousands of mice that need funerals, and if they don't get them, they'll never be at peace. And all those mice who can't rest will rise up, and then we'll have an army of zombie mice seeking revenge upon the living for ignoring them, and then we'll need funerals. Yes. Alright, we'll be there. A funeral wreath? Okay, yes, we'll dress up. See you soon. Chris terminated the call. Elise was grinning from ear to ear.
He put Pinkie on the phone, didn't he?
Chris looked up towards the ceiling with a frustrated grimace, hands balled into fists at the end of extended forearms. You can't just say no to her. Chris's face went serious for a second. Your logic is impeccable.
Mouse funeral?
Elise said, trying to stifle more laughter. Chris hung his head. Yeah. Elise put a hand on her husband's arm.
I'll get your suit.
Dan opened the door.
Chris, Elise, come in! I only wish we could meet under better circumstances.
Dan motioned for his guests to come in. He was wearing most of his Mr. Moneybags outfit, opting to leave out the mustachio and top hat for this somber occasion.
We saw each other yesterday, Dan,
Elise said, flatly. Chris came in, dragging a large funeral wreath in with him. Elise followed, holding a bouquet of white lilies. She had opted to dress in her black dress, and even went so far as to wear a black veil. The small group stood in front of the still erect Fort Dan Pie. Hey, Dan, Chris began. I hope... Chris and Elise stopped and stared at Pinkie. She was holding a shoebox that she had obviously decorated herself, given all the colorful stickers, bedazzled jewels, and glitter pen messages of, "We'll miss you," with the eyes dotted with hearts. What was strange was that she was wearing jeans and one of Dan's black jerk t-shirts.
I wear it ironically.
I don't own anything black, Pinkie explained. Racist. Elise tried to stifle a laugh and turned to Dan. She handed him a CD case.
Here, I thought this would be appropriate music for the deceased.
Dan looked down at the Dead Mouse album, then looked up, lowering his eyelids slightly.
You bought this on the way here, didn't you?
Elise's lips pulled up into a smile, desperately trying to hold back laughter.
Totally.
Funeral music is no joke, Elise. You should respect the dead.
Dan, you played Ding Dong the Witch is Dead at your grandma's funeral. Which old witch? Pinkie asked.
The Wicked Witch!
Dan answered. Elise couldn't take it anymore. She burst into fits of laughter, doubling up on herself. Pinkie frowned. Elise, this is serious. Elise looked up, smile still plastered on her face, and put a hand on Pinkie's shoulder.
I'm sorry, there... laughs of sorrow.
Oh, Pinkie responded. She attempted laughter, but it came out as a flat, ha 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 ha. She paused before saying, yeah, that just feels icky to me. Dan put a hand on his roommate's shoulder.
Would you like us to say some words for the departed?
He asked with a sympathetic look on his face. Pinkie smiled warmly at him. That would be very nice, Dan. Tears began to form behind her eyes. Thank you, she squeaked out. Dan nodded.
Elise, you're up.
Elise immediately ceased her laughing.
Me? Why me?
Dan grinned a malevolent smile.
You're clearly the most grief-stricken of us.
Pinkie nodded in agreement. That was the most sorrow laughter I've ever heard. Pinkie thought for a moment. Also the only sorrow laughter I've ever heard. Elise nervously looked from side to side.
Mousy was a good mouse. Always running. Great at avoiding carving knives. He lived a nice, full life of eating cheese before it was cut short by...
Mr. Mumbles eviscerated him and left him at our doorstep,
informed Dan.
Yeah, that.
Elise said, pointing an index finger into open air. How did you know his name was Mousy? Pinkie asked, wide-eyed.
Just a hunch.
Elise said, nervously grinning.
Alright, Chris, you're up.
Dan said. Chris put a fist up to his mouth and cleared his throat. Friends and loved ones of the deceased, we are gathered here today not only to say goodbye to our dear, dear friend, but to come together and honor the memory of one who enriched our lives with their very presence.
Lame!
Dan interrupted. Dan, I worked very hard on that, and... Dan turned to Pinky.
Would you like to say some words?
Hey! Chris protested. Pinky nodded. Mousy, I know you can hear me as your wrathful spirit is no doubt floating about, plotting its terrible vengeance on Dan's cat, but we want to remember you as the quiet little mouse that you were, and although we know you desperately would like to remain on the mortal coil, Dan has informed me that he totally knows a number of the real Ghostbusters, and I've watched the documentaries. Pinky paused before adding, they've taken out a Sumerian god, in an impressed-sounding tone, so please accept this offering of flowers and be at peace, yes. Elise collapsed to the floor as hysterical laughter escaped her mouth. Pinky sighed. It's okay, Elise, we'll make it through this together, she said resolutely. Pinky looked at her roommate. Dan? To Chris's surprise, Dan produced a worn Bible and opened it up to a bookmarked page. Elise stood up and quietly observed.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want.
Dan began in a dramatic tone.
He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters.
Dan motioned with a flat, even palm.
He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake.
Dan clutched a hand to his heart and looked up at the ceiling.
Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me.
Dan shook a fist within inches of his determined-looking face.
Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies.
Dan's fist shaking intensified.
Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over.
Dan opened his fist as his head bowed slightly.
Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Dan closed his Bible and added a small
Amen,
which Chris and Elise echoed.
Amen.
Pinky was crying. That was so beautiful, she said. The four went silent. So, what do we do with the box? Chris asked. Dan and Pinky exchanged glances. Pinky's face flushed with embarrassment. We, didn't think about that, she admitted. There was a sound of scratching at the door.
meow.
Dan opened the door to reveal Mr. Mumbles, a small, brown, dead, mangled bird sitting next to her. Dan, Chris, and Elise's faces went pale as they slowly turned to look at Pinky. Box still in hand, Pinky slumped her shoulders and looked down. Mr. Mumbles trotted over to her.
Meow.
She turned on her back, exposing her belly. Pinky slowly passed to the colorful shoebox to Dan. I give up, Pinky announced quietly, bending down to scratch Mr. Mumbles' belly.
Whoa, really?
Dan asked.
Just like that?
Pinky nodded. I'm afraid even I don't have the energy to hold a funeral for every animal Mr. Mumbles sends to the afterlife. Pinky continued scratching Mr. Mumbles. She's just so cute. Oh, who's a cute kitty murder machine? Who's a cutie kitty murder machine? Who's a cutie kitty murder machine? Oh, yes, you are. Oh, yes, you are. Pinky shifted from cute baby noises to full-on screaming. Yes, you are! Yes, you are! What about... Chris motioned with his head to the dead bird. Pinky sighed. Dan, can you throw the dead bird in with a mouse?
Sure.
Dan eyed the mangled bird pensively. Elise rolled her eyes, grabbed the bird by a wing. She swiftly opened the box, placed the corpse inside, and closed the box after it. Dan smiled.
Ashes to ashes, dust to dust,
He said, opening the door to the apartment and walking outside. Where are you taking it? Pinky asked.
Dumpster!
Dan called back. Elise and Chris turned to Pinky.
Are you sure you're okay with this?
Elise asked. Pinky glanced up, a side of her lip pulling up as well. Was all she had to offer. Pinky looked back at her two friends with a smile. Now who wants cake? Chris's eyes went wide. You have cake? Why didn't you say so in the first place? Pinky lightly scratched at her face with her index finger. Sorry, must have slipped my mind. Pinky opened the fridge to reveal the whole thing was filled with baked goods. Chris dropped to his knees and slowly extended his palms out. Everything looked delicious, even by non-Chris standards. Pinky, where did all this come from? Pinky rubbed the back of her head. I've kind of been on a baking frenzy ever since I started grocery shopping. Pinky grabbed a multi-layered chocolate cake and handed it to Chris, who eyed it with glee.
Dessert time?
Dan asked, walking towards the sink and washing his hands. Pinky strategically searched the fridge, pulling out a colorful cupcake and handing it to Dan. Yepper, she replied. Dan gleefully took it and dug in as Elise washed her hands. You think the bird will seek revenge on us? Pinky asked, grabbing plates from a cupboard. Dan shrugged.
Don't worry about it,
he said through a mouthful of cupcake. The night was still, like a predator in the darkness of a deep forest, quietly waiting for the perfect moment to strike unsuspecting prey. Slowly, the lid to the dumpster began to rise. Beady red eyes flashed in the darkness. A tattered wing slinked out from the shadows and raised the lid more. Slowly, the eyes moved forward into the moonlight. A small yellow beak broke through shadows, followed by the rest of the tattered face of the once living bird. Half of its face was simply black blood caked onto a skull. Cheep! Cheep! It cried into the night. It would not dwell in that box of dead, squashed mouse, nor would this stinking land of garbage be its tomb. It would have its revenge. It would feast on... Cheep! The undead bird uttered a startled cry as a liquid sprayed out and made contact, the substance causing its very body to smoke and fall away. It stumbled back into its refuse sarcophagus and fell dead, as the liquid ate away at its body. Dan moved the squirt gun towards his lips and blew on the barrel. Holy water, huh? Pinky asked. Dan twirled the gun in his hand and holstered it in his jeans waistband in a swift movement.
Yep.
Neato! Pinky said. Teach me? She asked with a hopeful smile.
Do you think you can bless salt in the name of the Father Almighty, recite a psalm's worth of scripture, exorcise creatures of water by invoking a prayer of Solomon, and buy bottled water despite the fact that tap water is perfectly safe to drink and is practically free?
Dan asked. Pinky smiled and shrugged. I have no idea, Pinky said cheerfully.
Well, let's find out,
Dan said as the roommates turned and started walking back towards their apartment. Blooper! Thanks to Mithril Moth for his continual boatload of corrections on these early chapters.
He didn't do enough.
He did.
Yeah, that was like 4 really big ones, too. Is that what being are a dragon?
Is it a what being a dragon? Y'all!
Alright,
That was
flag the video.
Come to Elise.
You already are do Elise.
No, it's a better Elise. Because my Elise is just...
No! I've gained 60 pounds! That wasn't the line. I was positive.
Elise likewise broke into laughter.
We saw each other yesterday, Dan.
She's a girl.
Elise said flat.
We saw each other yesterday, Dan.
It's fine,
Okay,
Mom.
Alright, wait.
Elise couldn't take it anymore. She burst into fits of laughter, doubling up on herself.
Message to Raoul, you know who you are. I am trying.